Return my wallet right now! How dare you! The woman screaming at the entrance no longer seemed human. She was the worst kind of woman, referring to my beloved eldest son as a mere wallet. Nancy, who had emotionally and physically exhausted Scott, was the worst. Trembling with anger beside me, Scott stood, looking frail and frightened. David, protecting his brother, gazed at Nancy with an icy stare. Before I could speak, David quietly asked, facing the entrance,
"Emma, do you also see Dad just as a wallet? Depending on your answer, I might not forgive you."
David was looking intently at Nancy's granddaughter, Emma, standing beside her. Beside the arrogant Nancy, Emma looked away, her eyes darting. I held David back and told Emma, "If you think of Dad as just a wallet, then Grandma is your enemy too." Emma's face turned pale, and she burst into tears, apologizing. She then ran towards me, away from Nancy. Betrayed by Emma, Nancy's eyebrows raised in fury. Nancy had never even manipulated her granddaughter to enslave Scott. "Nancy, I will never forgive you!" In front of a pale-faced Scott and a calm David, I declared, "My name is Violet. I'm 65 and I divorced my husband when I was young. We had 2 sons together, but I was the one who raised them. I've worked at a local accounting firm for many years. Having worked there even before my divorce, I had a stable income. My ex-husband used to complain that I lacked charm. By the time I was pregnant with my second son, our relationship had already soured. And during my second pregnancy, my ex-husband started an affair with another woman. I lost all patience with him. After the divorce, I relentlessly demanded alimony and child support from him. I don't even want to remember his face. He was a dreamer, not the brightest, a despicable man who ran off with another woman. Scott and David were born from such a terrible ex-husband. Scott and David were brothers, but with a 6-year age difference. David was born a year before our divorce. We became a single-parent family, but I worked hard so we were financially stable. Scott was naive and initially missed his father. David, just a baby at the time of the divorce, had no memories of his father. After becoming a single parent, I juggled childcare and work to the best of my ability. Scott was a dreamer like his father, naive about the world. In contrast, David had a sharp personality just like me. Scott and David were polar opposites, but parenting them brought out strange feelings in me. I couldn't help but be lenient with Scott, who resembled my ex-husband. Scott was kind and innocent, but not exactly bright. Yet he looked so adorable, like an angel. David was truly a carbon copy of me, a calm personality with excellent grades, my pride and joy. But David was also thoughtful of his mother and his brother. Scott was somewhat intimidated by his younger brother David. David couldn't leave his brother Scott alone and often helped him. Ours was a single-parent family, but Scott and David had a good brotherly bond, bringing joy to our lives. Scott, perhaps due to the trauma of my divorce, never dated women. Struggling with academics, he got a job right after high school. David went to a prestigious university, acknowledged by everyone. Scott proudly spoke of David as his beloved brother. We both, I and David, dearly loved Scott for his pure and honest nature. However, our peaceful family life changed with Scott's words.
"Mom, David, I got married."
He met his wife at a work party. Inexperienced in relationships, Scott was smitten with her. That woman was Nancy, and they were already married by the time he told us. I was shocked by Scott's abrupt marriage, but David remained calm.
"A woman that Scott falls for. I'm curious to meet her."
David's words were tinged with unmistakable sarcasm. The wise David could see through Scott's harshness easily. When Nancy came for the marriage introduction, she was beautiful. But that was all. Nancy, now my eldest son's wife, told me and David, "Violet, David, I'll make Scott happy." When we saw Nancy, David and I exchanged knowing glances. This woman, beautiful, but seemed a bit strong-willed. That was our first impression of Nancy. As expected, Nancy turned out to be terrifying. Scott, after marrying her, experienced this firsthand. After Scott got married, David graduated from college and landed a job at a large corporation. I was relieved that both my sons had successfully left the nest. But that feeling of relief was short-lived. Just as David was planning to move out from our home, I was involved in an accident. On my way home from the accounting firm, I collided with a motorcycle. Thankfully, I wasn't severely injured, but I was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. David immediately came to the hospital, and seeing that I was safe, he was relieved.
Thank goodness. It wasn't a serious accident. Mom, what about Scott?
The hospital informed him, but he has Emma to take care of. At the time, our granddaughter Emma was a toddler. Scott was busy with childcare and couldn't easily come to the hospital. I thought so, but David seemed suspicious. When I asked him what was on his mind, he said in a dissatisfied tone,
It's strange that Scott didn't rush her when Mom had an accident.
Now that you mention it, it's odd that the kind-hearted Scott didn't rush over when I was taken away in an ambulance. The same Scott who would always ask with concern,
Mom, are you okay?
Whenever I looked even slightly unwell. David took care of the hospital formalities and the various treatment costs. The motorcycle driver was very apologetic and promised to cover all the medical expenses. Leaving all the insurance procedures to David, Scott was nowhere to be seen. I stayed in the hospital for a few days for tests, but Scott only came the day before I was discharged. David was about to get angry at Scott, but stopped at the last moment. Seeing Scott, I understood why David calmed his anger. Scott looked worse than me, who was hospitalized. Forgetting his anger, David asked Scott,
Scott, are you feeling unwell? You look pale.
Concerned, David turned to Scott, who smiled weakly.
Emma had terrible tantrums. I haven't slept in days.
When Scott apologized for not being able to come to the hospital, I asked him, What about Nancy? Even if Emma throws tantrums, Nancy should be taking care of her, right? Scott only replied,
Nancy is tired.
But after I was discharged, Nancy came to our house without any guilt. Violet, I was so worried. Nancy looked fine. She brought Emma, but just left her watching videos on her mobile phone. I started to worry. Had Scott gotten involved with the terrible woman? David seemed to agree and postponed his plans to move out. Time passed. Scott and Nancy were now 36 and David was 30. I'm still working at the accounting firm. David, young for his position, had been promoted to a manager at the large corporation. Scott stopped coming home altogether. Neither Nancy nor Emma visited. I wondered if Scott felt inferior to David. I thought that might be why he was avoiding coming home. But David scoffed at my thoughts.
Mom doesn't understand Scott. He wouldn't avoid coming home for such a reason.
That's true. Scott and David always got along well. I was troubled, pondering what was keeping Scott away from home. Then one day, Nancy and Emma suddenly came to visit. Nancy was still beautiful, but her makeup seemed heavier than usual. Influenced by her mother, Emma, only 11, was wearing makeup too. Before I could say anything, Emma stretched out her hand. Grandma, give me $100 as an allowance. The first thing my granddaughter did was to demand $100 from me. Did she mistake her grandma for an ATM? As I stood there, stunned, Nancy didn't even bother to reprimand Emma. Violet, Scott's salary isn't enough for Emma to buy the clothes she likes. Both Nancy and Emma were dressed in flashy brand name clothes. Were they squandering Scott's salary on such extravagance? Nancy and Emma, demanding money, looked foolish and frivolous. Angry, I rejected Nancy and Emma's request. I don't appreciate being asked for money out of the blue. When I firmly refused, Nancy glared at me with eyes narrowed in anger. Who do you think married your dull son? I realized this was Nancy's true nature. Emma, mimicking her mom, laughed and called me, Old woman! While we were glaring at each other, David came home. Upon seeing Nancy and Emma, he immediately said,
A foolish daughter-in-law and niece are no family of mine. Get out!
Undeterred, Emma shamelessly asked David for money. David, if you're making big bucks at your corporation job, give me an allowance.
Emma, come back when you have raised your IQ.
As David glared sharply, Nancy and Emma left, clicking their tongues. After kicking them out, David sighed and murmured,
It's clear now how Scott is being treated.
A few days after David kicked out Nancy and Emma, on a weekend he and I were relaxing at home. I was worried about Scott, but I had another concern. David had the financial means to live independently, but was still staying at home. Actually, David had a girlfriend at the large corporation where they both started together. They had been dating since they joined, and I wondered if they were thinking of marriage. While drinking tea, I asked David, "David, are you staying at home because you're worried about Mom and Scott?" I sighed, and David responded with a wry smile.
"I'm thinking of marrying my girlfriend, but she's busy with work too."
They were both considering marriage, but their busy lives kept them from becoming a couple. I wasn't sure if that was the truth or if David was just being considerate of me. Despite his sharp tongue, David is kind to those he cares about. As I pondered this, the doorbell rang. David checked who it was, and I saw him gasp. Without hesitation, he ran to the door. I followed and found Scott, weakened and collapsed at the door. To my shock, Scott weakly pleaded,
"Mom, please let me stay for just one day."
Scott, emaciated and pale, was clearly suffering from malnutrition. As David carried Scott, he asked me,
"Let Scott rest. Mom, call the nearby hospital. He probably needs an IV."
I nodded at David's instructions and called our familiar hospital. The doctor who came for a house visit said that Scott was weak from overwork and malnutrition. We were told that it could have been life-threatening if he was found any later, which sent chills down my spine. Even after the IV treatment, Scott remained motionless, asleep. I wondered why Scott had come to us in such a state. As I pondered, I heard Scott crying. Entering the room, I saw David soothing Scott, who was in tears. In a gentle voice, I asked Scott, "Scott, can you tell me what happened?" Scott just kept crying and didn't respond. David quietly explained instead.
"Scott was being treated like a slave by Nancy and Emma. They forced him into doing side jobs and he was exhausted."
Nancy and Emma had been exploiting Scott, making him work hard to earn money. Scott had to come to me for help, completely worn out. I couldn't help but shout, "Why didn't you come to Mom before it got this bad?" Scott kept crying, even as I lamented. David sighed and admonished me gently.
"Mom, Scott is tired. Don't raise your voice."
Nodding at David's words, I stroked Scott's head and said, "Let's live together here." At my proposal, Scott raised his tearful face and asked, "Really?" I smiled at the weakened Scott. "Of course. Now, rest easy." Scott finally seemed reassured and fell asleep. David looked at me and muttered,
"I doubt that foolish Nancy will stay quiet."
His words proved accurate. The next day, Nancy and Emma stormed in, but I had made up my mind. "Nancy, I will never forgive you!" Nancy was screaming outside our house like a mad woman. "Give me back my wallet now!" Even though Scott was weak, she intended to exploit him further. Despite telling Scott to hide in his room, he came out, frightened by Nancy's voice. Even after being mistreated and exhausted, he still obeyed Nancy. David said it was a complete dependency. Despite the abuse, Scott didn't want to be hated and depended on her. He had been in this dreadful relationship for too long. Why Scott depended on such a terrifying woman was beyond me, but it was clear that Nancy and Scott shouldn't continue their marriage. Before Nancy arrived, Scott had a long talk with David. It became clear that Scott wanted a divorce. He had thought about it many times, but Nancy's threats made him give up. I confronted Nancy directly. "Nancy, unfortunately, Scott wants a divorce. Will you just leave after the divorce?" Provoked, Nancy distorted her face with anger and yelled at Scott. "Scott, you're abandoning me and Emma? You know what will happen. How dare you?" To Nancy's threats, I smiled mischievously. "Things won't end well. Nancy, the one in trouble isn't us, it's you." We consulted a lawyer to sue Nancy for harming Scott physically and mentally. The lawyer wouldn't stay silent once he examined Scott's weakened condition. When I mentioned this, Nancy laughed loudly. "Don't be ridiculous. This is a marital issue. A husband being oppressed by his wife is just embarrassing." Nancy unwittingly confessed, unaware that David was recording everything on a voice recorder. Was she too careless out of fear? Scott also had a responsibility for not seeking a divorce sooner and becoming dependent. If Scott had stood firm, Emma wouldn't have followed Nancy's example. I reflected on my part in indulging Scott's innocence. David, expressionless, asked a trembling Scott,
Scott, tell us in your own words. What do you want? Do you want a divorce?
Looking at David, Scott, lips quivering, finally said, I want a divorce. I can't take being exploited by Nancy anymore. At Scott's words, David nodded and smiled slightly.
Understood. Mom, we can really bring Nancy down.
David seemed almost excited as he said this, and Nancy started to look a bit intimidated. Unlike the kind and naive Scott, David was not someone who could be easily subdued. David, quick to act while Scott was bedridden, set in motion a plan to bring Nancy down. He contacted his girlfriend, whom he was dating. David graduated with a degree in economics, but his girlfriend was a law graduate. Although she worked in a regular company, she had connections with excellent lawyers. David used his connections as a means to save Scott. Upon learning the situation, David's girlfriend, who was a senior in the same law school and specialized in family and domestic issues, referred us to a strong attorney. The lawyer, after confirming my and David's testimonies and examining Scott's condition, declared confidently, the likelihood of domestic violence is strong. He asserted that if we filed a lawsuit, we would likely win. This meant Scott could not only file for divorce, but also demand compensation from Nancy in the divorce proceedings, and even pursue criminal charges. As I explained this calmly, Nancy's face gradually turned pale. That's exaggerated. Scott is the incompetent one. Despite Nancy's dismissive response, I calmly said, a wife forcing her husband to work unreasonably and verbally abusing him is a valid reason for divorce, and we can sue you to the point of no return. I persuaded her that if she quietly agreed to the divorce, we wouldn't sue. But Nancy snapped, Scott is my wallet, and lunged at me. I had been waiting for this moment. I purposely fell and yelled loudly, Someone help! My daughter-in-law is trying to strangle me! Neighbors rushed out of their houses at my scream. David quietly grabbed his phone.
Hello? My mom is being attacked by her daughter-in-law.
The police arrived quickly after David's call. They listened to the story, looking incredulously at Nancy. Nancy insisted, I'm innocent. My mother-in-law fell on her own. However, Emma contradicted her. Mom attacked Grandma. That's why Grandma fell. Betrayed by Emma, Nancy is furious. In her anger, Nancy struck Emma's cheek. The police witnessing this took Nancy away unconditionally. Due to insufficient evidence in the domestic dispute, Nancy was released. But I relentlessly sued her. Nancy didn't work herself. She used Scott's salary for leisure with Emma. Eventually running out of money, she threatened Scott and made him work incessantly without rest. Scott is now pressing for a divorce, citing Nancy's domestic violence. Thanks to a competent lawyer, the divorce between Scott and Nancy was smoothly finalized. It was deemed impossible for Nancy to have custody, so Scott got Emma's custody. Nancy was sued for compensation by Scott, which she initially refused, despite being warned by the lawyer about the consequences of not paying. Scott, exhausted from overwork, hasn't been in good health. David and I have been taking turns nursing him. Emma seems uncomfortable, possibly realizing her mistake. Neither David nor I have completely forgiven her. We fear she might turn out like Nancy. Life was peaceful for a while, but then an incident occurred. Nancy, in a fit of revenge, caused a scene at the lawyer's office, a hopeless person never learning her lesson. However, Nancy was reported by the staff at the lawyer's office. She was arrested by the police for damaging the office's equipment and faced demands for compensation. According to David, this was an expected outcome at the lawyer's office. Nancy is struggling with the compensation to Scott and the damages to the lawyer's office. Furthermore, she's legally prohibited from approaching Scott. No longer a daughter-in-law, Nancy was disowned by her family. Nancy, struggling to pay a large sum of money borrowed from dangerous financial institutions. It was clear that the growing interest would make repayment difficult, but that's fine. She should suffer for exploiting Scott for her own greed. I thanked David's girlfriend, who had been consulting with David for quite a while. David had realized that Scott was avoiding home due to being threatened by Nancy. He had confided in his girlfriend, asking for her support in case of an emergency. I took a leave of absence to nurse the bedridden Scott. Ultimately, without David's initiative, we couldn't have saved Scott. Mothers can be so powerless, I muttered. As I said this, Scott, who had been sleeping, woke up. His complexion seemed better, perhaps due to his recovery. While drinking lukewarm water, Scott said to me, "If only I had been more resolute, strong and smart like David." Scott was remorseful, blaming himself for his weakness. I told Scott, who was tearfully regretting firmly, though it might seem harsh, "If you feel ashamed, then be resolute from now on." Scott, looking down, finally lifted his head and nodded firmly. Since Scott regained his strength, he returned to his job from which he had been on leave. Though his side jobs were discovered at work, his boss, understanding Scott's circumstances, decided not to pursue the matter. Currently, Scott is living with David and me at home. Emma was sternly told by David, her uncle,
"Emma, you'll be enrolled in a very strict boarding school to straighten out your character."
David decided to send Emma to a strict boarding school, judging it difficult for Scott to correct her behavior. Honestly, I couldn't unconditionally love Emma, who had sided with Nancy at this stage. A disciplined school with communal living was better for Emma's future. Scott was worried about Emma, but David quietly told him,
"I told Emma to write a letter when she reflects on her actions."
So, Emma is receiving strict education at the boarding school. I retired from the accounting firm and am living freely. Scott moved, settling near our home. He received several letters from Emma saying, "Dad, I'm sorry," that Emma seems to have adapted to the boarding school and is studying energetically. She calls David for help with difficult study questions. David seems happy to see Emma changing for the better.
"Next vacation when Emma returns, I have something to report,"
David said. Scott and I were curious. Then, during the school break, Emma came home. The Emma we met after a long time was much more polite. "Dad, Grandma, David, I'm back home." "Welcome back, Emma. Grandma has prepared a feast for you." Finally, I could let go of the past and embrace Emma as my granddaughter. Just as we were about to enjoy dinner, David made his announcement.
"I'm getting married. My fiancé will come to greet you soon."
David decided to marry after Scott and Emma settled down. Scott congratulated him with a smile.
"David, congratulations!"
Emma also smiled happily. "David, congratulations!" Tears welled up in my eyes as I watched this scene. "Congratulations, David. Be happy." David nodded happily at my words.